Hello there, and welcome to Binge-Worthy History. Tonight we are stepping through the gates of a Tang Dynasty inn on the Silk Road, somewhere in the heart of China in the year 800 AD, a world of candlelit courtyards, the smell of mutton and rice wine, the distant sound of a peeper being plucked somewhere in the dark, and the endless, restless movement of people crossing one of the greatest trading civilizations the world has ever known. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and like the video and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now let's begin. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a long dirt road that stretches from somewhere behind you, somewhere far to the west, beyond the deserts of Central Asia. And ahead of you, not far at all, there is a cluster of warm light. It is evening. The sun has gone down behind the mountains, leaving a thin band of orange along the horizon, and the sky above you is deepening into that particular shade of blue that comes just before true dark. You are tired. Your feet ache. You have been walking or riding since before dawn, and the weight of the day is sitting across your shoulders like a physical thing. The warm light ahead of you is an inn, a ludian, the locals call it. Though in the Tang Dynasty, such establishments were known by various names depending on their size and purpose, and it is exactly what you need. The Tang Dynasty, for those unfamiliar with it, was one of the most remarkable periods in Chinese history. It lasted from 618 to 907 AD, and by the year 800 it was at or very near its absolute peak. The capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, was at that time the largest city in the world, home to perhaps 1 million people within its walls alone, and its population included Chinese citizens of every class and profession, Buddhist monks, Zoroastrian priests, Nestorian Christians, Islamic merchants from Persia and Arabia, Jewish traders, Sogdian middlemen, Tibetan diplomats, Japanese scholars, Korean artists, and an enormous floating population of travelers passing through on business or pilgrimage. The Tang court was famously cosmopolitan. The emperor, Xuanzong, who had ruled for decades earlier in the century, had an entire troupe of Central Asian musicians at court. Polo, a game of Central Asian origin, was wildly popular among the Tang aristocracy. Foreign fashions, foreign foods, foreign religions, and foreign ideas moved through the Tang world with a freedom that would not be matched in China for centuries. The Silk Road was the artery through which all of this flowed. It was not, strictly speaking, a single road. It was a network of routes, some crossing the deserts of the Tarim Basin, some skirting along the southern slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains, some branching down through the Hindu Kush into northern India. And along these routes, over the course of centuries, the goods and ideas of the known world moved back and forth. Silk went west, glass came east. Horses from Fergana, the famous blood-sweating heavenly horses the Han Dynasty had once gone to war to acquire, were still being traded into China. Cotton, lapis lazuli, spices, gold and silver flowed in both directions. Buddhism had traveled from India to China along these same roads centuries earlier. So had papermaking go in the other direction, eventually toward the Islamic world and then into Europe. The inn you are approaching tonight sits on one of the major arteries of this network, somewhere in the Gansu corridor, that long, narrow strip of habitable land between the mountains and the desert through which nearly all westward trade from the Chinese heartland was funneled. This is not a grand establishment. It is not the kind of inn that a high Tang official would choose on a diplomatic mission with lacquered furniture and silk screens and a private courtyard. It is a working inn built for people who are on the road because the road is their life. Merchants transporting bolts of silk and dried fruit and raw ore, monks on pilgrimage to sacred sites, soldiers moving between garrison towns, government couriers carrying documents under official seal, and every variety of itinerant laborer, fortune seeker, fugitive, and wanderer that the Tang world produced in such abundance. The building itself, as you approach it, resolves out of the dusk into a low, wide structure built around a central courtyard. The walls are rammed earth, thick and slightly uneven, plastered on the outside with a clay mixture that has been baked hard by years of sun. The roof tiles are grey-green, the colour of old celadon, and they curve up at the corners in the distinctive Tang style, though not dramatically. This is not a palace or a temple, and nobody has spent much artistic energy on the roofline. What catches your eye is the lantern hanging above the gate. It is made of oiled paper, stretched over a bamboo frame, and the candle inside it burns with a steady orange light that sways slightly as a night breeze comes down from the mountains. Around the base of the lantern someone has painted a few characters in red. The name of the inn, and below it, the single word that every tired traveller on the Silk Road wanted to see: accommodation. The gate is a wooden affair, heavy planks bound with iron, and it stands open. A boy of about 12 sits on a stool just inside the gate, half asleep, tasked with watching the entrance and calling for the innkeeper when guests arrive. He jerks upright as you approach, blinks at you with the wide, momentarily unfocused eyes of someone woken from a genuine sleep, and in the next instant is on his feet and calling out into the courtyard in a high, clear voice. The innkeeper comes quickly. This is the kind of establishment where the innkeeper lives on the premises and is always available because the road does not observe regular hours and guests arrive at all times of day and night. The innkeeper of this particular inn is a man in his mid-40s, stocky and weathered, with calloused hands and the particular kind of shrewdness in his eyes that comes from spending decades assessing strangers at a glance and deciding what they can afford and whether they are likely to cause trouble. His name, let's say, is Liu Wei, though he would be known most commonly to his regular guests simply as Laoban, boss. He is wearing a plain cotton robe, slightly rumpled because he has indeed been sleeping, and he has pulled a heavier outer garment on over it as he came to meet you. He bows, not deeply, not the bow of a servant, but the compact, professional bow of a man who respects the transaction he is about to enter into, and he asks where you have come from, which is not idle conversation, but is instead the opening move in a rapid mental calculation about your status, your likely needs, and your probable ability to pay. The courtyard that opens up behind Liu Wei is roughly square, perhaps 30 feet on a side, and it is still busy despite the hour. This is one of the distinguishing features of a Silk Road inn in the Tang period. It never fully sleeps because the road never fully sleeps. There are animals along the eastern wall, 3 camels and several horses tied to iron rings set into the wall, fed and watered by a stable boy who moves among them with practiced quietness. The camels are Bactrian camels, the double-humped variety bred for cold desert travel, and even tied and still they have an air of magnificent endurance about them, their dark eyes reflecting the lantern light with a kind of ancient patience. The horses are smaller, of mixed breeding, the practical travel animals of merchants, rather than the tall Fergana thoroughbreds of the cavalry. Along the western and northern walls are the guest rooms, a series of low doors set into the thick earthen wall, each one leading into a small chamber just big enough for a sleeping mat, a low table, and a brazier for warmth. The doors are spaced close together, which tells you that the rooms themselves are quite small. This is not a place of luxury but of function, and the primary function is simply to provide a horizontal surface and a roof. Some of the doors are closed and dark behind them, meaning those guests are already sleeping. Others stand slightly open, and from these come the small domestic sounds of people settling in for the night, the rustle of bedding, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional cough. In the center of the courtyard there is a fire pit with a low iron grate over it, and the fire is still burning, though it has burned down to a deep red bed of coals rather than an active flame. Around the fire, on low wooden stools and on the bare ground, a small group of people sit in that particular configuration of people who do not know each other, but who have been sharing a space long enough that the formality has softened somewhat. There are 4 of them, 2 men who appear to be travelling together and have the look of merchants from somewhere west of the passes. Their clothing cut slightly differently from the Chinese norm, their faces darker, their beards fuller. And 2 others who are clearly Chinese. One, a middle-aged man who has the bearing of a minor official or perhaps a prosperous craftsman, and one younger, perhaps 20 years old, who sits slightly apart and watches the fire with the self-conscious detachment of someone who is not yet sure of his place in the world. Liu Wei leads you across the courtyard and begins his business. There are rooms available. He has several, as tonight is not particularly busy, and he names his prices. The prices are given in copper coins, the everyday currency of Tang commercial life, though he would also accept silk in small pieces, which throughout this period functioned as a kind of secondary currency for larger transactions. For a single copper coin you can have a sleeping mat on the floor of the common room. For 3 copper coins you get a private room of your own, small as it is. For 5 copper coins you get the private room, and a meal, and the meal, Liu Wei is careful to note, is a proper meal, not the sort of thing that some inns pass off as food. His cook, he adds, is a woman from Sichuan. You choose the private room and the meal, and Liu Wei nods with professional satisfaction, gives a few quiet instructions to the boy, who has now materialized at his elbow, and directs you to the wash basin along the north wall, where you can rinse your face and hands before eating. The wash basin is a wide clay vessel, unglazed and slightly rough to the touch, filled with water from the well in the corner of the courtyard. The water is cold, bracingly, almost shockingly cold, because the temperature drops quickly in this part of the world once the sun is gone, and the sensation of it on your face after a long day of road dust and dry wind is one of those small, physical pleasures that, in the right circumstances, feels close to sublime. The kitchen is at the back of the main building, in a low-ceilinged room thick with smoke and steam that vents through a gap between the roof tiles. The cook, Liu Wei's wife as it happens, has been at work since before you arrived, because food in a Silk Road Inn is not prepared to order in the way a restaurant might cook for you today, but rather produced in quantity as a matter of ongoing readiness. A large pot of millet porridge sits at the back of the stove and can be served at almost any hour, always warm, always ready. There are also stuffed flatbreads wrapped in cloth, hubing, the bread of the Silk Road, a round leavened bread with a sesame-seeded top that had come originally from Central Asia and become so ubiquitous in Tang China that it was sold from street carts in Chang'an. And tonight, because it is still early enough in the evening, there is also a clay pot of mutton and turnip stew, fragrant with star anise and a few dried chili peppers, that has been simmering since mid-afternoon. The mutton stew deserves a moment of attention. Mutton, goat and sheep meat was the primary meat of the Tang Silk Road corridor for a simple reason. Sheep and goats travelled the road themselves, on the hoof, and could be slaughtered as needed. Pork, the most culturally significant meat in Chinese cuisine, was eaten in the eastern heartland but was largely unavailable in the western regions, where the population included Muslims and Zoroastrians for whom it was forbidden, and where the keeping of pigs was impractical for a corridor population that was constantly in motion. Mutton therefore occupied a central place in the cuisine of this world, and a skilled cook knew how to make it work in a dozen different ways. The stew in Liu Wei's kitchen has been cooked slowly enough that the meat is completely tender, falling apart at the touch of chopsticks, and the broth has taken on the rich, dark color of long-cooked bone marrow. The meal is served in the main room of the inn, which opens off the courtyard to the south. It is a long room, low-beamed, lit by oil lamps set in niches in the wall. The tables are simple, heavy slabs of wood on low supports, in the Tang style that predates the higher table and chair arrangements that would become standard in later Chinese history. You eat sitting on cushions or on folded mats, with your food on a low table before you. This posture, close to the ground, is deeply practical for a communal eating space that needs to accommodate many people in a compact room. More bodies fit, and the furniture is lighter and easier to move. The other travelers you noticed around the fire have come in for the meal as well. The two Western merchants, they are Sogdians you gather from the way they speak to each other, in a language that has the melodic quality of a Persian dialect, are eating with the focused efficiency of men who are hungry but have no time for ceremony. The Sogdians were, throughout this period, the primary middlemen of the Silk Road. They were a people from the region of Samarkand and Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, culturally Iranian but commercially oriented, who had been trading along the routes between China and the Middle East for centuries. Their diaspora communities existed in every major city along the Silk Road, from Dunhuang in the east to Merv in the west, and a Sogdian merchant arriving in Chang'an in 800 AD could count on finding other Sogdians already established there, people who spoke his language and could help him navigate the complex bureaucratic requirements that the Tang government imposed on foreign traders. The older Chinese man, whose name is something like Master Chen, turns out to be a government salt official traveling from Lanzhou to inspect a salt works depot further along the road. He eats slowly and with deliberate attention to his food, the way a man eats when he is dining alone and has learned to make the meal itself a kind of companionship. He pours himself rice wine from a small ceramic flask. The wine is pale, slightly cloudy, warm from having sat near the kitchen fire, and drinks it in small, considered sips. He does not speak to the Sogdians, not because of hostility, but simply because they share no common language, though he watches them with a quiet, curious intelligence that suggests he finds the world of the road endlessly interesting after years of travel. The young man, who gives his name as Zhang, and who is from somewhere in Henan province to the east, is on his way to Dunhuang. He has the look of someone who has left home for the first time, and is trying not to show how far outside his comfort he is. He eats the stew with great concentration as though it requires his full attention, and when he glances up it is quickly and with a slight defensiveness, the way young men look when they are in unfamiliar company and are not yet sure what the rules are. He is, you eventually gather from a few exchanged words, a Buddhist monk, or rather, he is on his way to becoming one, traveling west to study at one of the great cave temple complexes of Dunhuang, where thousands of scrolls and manuscript copies of sutras and commentaries are held in repositories cut into the cliff face. The cave temples of Dunhuang, the Mogao caves, were at this point in history one of the most important Buddhist sites in the world. They had been carved and decorated over several centuries, beginning in the 4th century AD, and by 800 they comprised hundreds of individual cave chapels, each one painted floor to ceiling with elaborate murals depicting Buddhist cosmology, narrative scenes from the Jataka tales of the Buddha's previous lives, and portraits of the patrons who had funded each cave's construction. The caves housed an enormous library of manuscripts, not only Buddhist texts but also administrative documents, secular literature, medical texts, and commercial records, that would, centuries later, be sealed into a hidden chamber and not discovered again until 1900. At this moment, however, they are living, active, maintained daily by monks and nuns, visited by pilgrims from across Asia, and young Zhang's pilgrimage to study there is entirely unremarkable because hundreds of people like him make the same journey every year. After the meal, Liu Wei's wife, whose name, let's say, is Auntie Zhao, since she is known primarily by this honorific in the inn community, brings tea. The tea is not the refined ceremonial tea that would become famous in later Chinese culture and in the Japanese tea ceremony that derived from it. It is a practical, working beverage, brick tea, pressed and dried, broken into pieces and boiled in water with a pinch of salt and sometimes a small amount of rendered animal fat in the Central Asian style. This tea, sometimes called butter tea in the Tibetan tradition that also borrows from it, is thick, dark, warming and sustaining. More like a soup than a beverage in the way a modern person would understand tea, but perfectly designed for the cold nights and hard physical demands of the road. The fire in the courtyard has been built up again by the stable boy, and a few of the guests drift back outside to sit beside it. The night air is cold but not yet bitter. It is, let's say, late autumn, the time of year when the days are still warm enough for comfortable travel, but the nights drop sharply and everyone sleeps under heavier covers than they did a month ago. The camels in their corner of the courtyard have settled into a ruminating stillness, their heads moving in the slow, rhythmic way of ruminants at rest, their humps casting strange double shadows in the firelight. One of the horses stamps and shifts, and the stable boy murmurs something quiet and reassuring without looking up from the fire. Liu Wei comes out to join the group around the fire for a while. This is part of his job in a way. The innkeeper as social center, the person who facilitates the informal exchange of information that was one of the primary functions of a Silk Road inn. In an age without newspapers, without bulletin boards, without any of the information infrastructure that a modern person takes for granted, an inn was where you found out what was happening on the road ahead of you. Was the pass above Jiayuguan clear, or had there been snow? Were there bandits operating near the next garrison town? Had the bridge over the river been repaired yet after the spring floods? Was there a festival happening in the next city, which might mean full accommodation and high prices? This kind of practical intelligence moved through the inn network with remarkable efficiency, carried from mouth to ear by the constant flow of travelers. Liu Wei has been innkeeping here for nearly 15 years. He came to it through his father, who had operated the same inn before him, and his father had taken it over from the man who built it, a retired cavalry sergeant from the garrison at Jiayuguan, who had recognized 40 years earlier that a good inn at this particular point on the road would never lack for customers. Liu Wei knows the road as well as any merchant who travels it regularly. He knows the distances between each way station, the quality of each water source, the reliability of each garrison outpost, the names and reputations of innkeepers, all the way from Lanzhou to Dunhuang. He is, in the language of the Tang administration, a registered innkeeper. The inn appears in local records, pays taxes, and is subject to periodic inspection by local officials. And this official status is something he takes seriously, because the alternative, operating without registration, would expose him to periodic harassment and the risk of arbitrary closure. The Tang government took the regulation of travel and accommodation seriously. The Silk Road was, from the state's perspective, simultaneously a source of enormous commercial revenue and a potential security risk. The same routes that brought silk west and horses east also provided pathways for spies, smugglers, dissidents, and military threats. The government maintained a system of official relay stations along the main roads, spaced roughly one day's travel apart, where officials with proper documentation could obtain fresh horses, food, and accommodation at government expense. These relay stations, were not available to ordinary travelers, but their existence meant that the Tang state had a physical presence along the road at regular intervals, and private innkeepers like Liu Wei operated in the shadow of this official infrastructure. Travel passes were required for long-distance movement in Tang China. If you were going beyond your home county, and certainly if you were going anywhere near the sensitive western frontier zones, you needed a document issued by the local government that specified your identity, your point of origin, your stated destination, and your purpose of travel. When you arrived at an inn, you were supposed to present this document for recording. The innkeeper was supposed to keep a register of guests. This system was imperfectly implemented. The Tang bureaucracy, like all bureaucracies, was better in theory than in practice, and there were enough travelers moving through the corridor that checking papers rigorously at every stop would have brought commerce to a halt. But it existed, and it meant that Liu Wei's inn was a node in a loose information network that extended all the way back to the provincial capital and ultimately to Chang'an. Back around the fire, one of the Sogdian merchants is the older of the two, a broad-shouldered man with grey beginning to streak his dark beard, has produced a small leather sack from somewhere in his clothing and is showing something to his companion. In the firelight you can see that it is a piece of glass, a small flask of deep blue, beautifully made, of the kind that was produced in the workshops of the Byzantine world and the Sasanian Persian world and traded east along the Silk Road in enormous quantities. Glass was a prestige item in Tang China. Chinese craftsmen had not yet mastered the technique of blowing glass into the thin-walled, transparent vessels that the Western workshops produced, and imported glass commanded high prices in Chang'an's luxury market. This small blue flask, if it reaches the capital intact, will sell for many times what the merchant paid for it in whatever workshop or bazaar he acquired it, somewhere to the west. The young monk Zhang watches this transaction with open curiosity. He has never been west of his home province before this journey, and the Silk Road world is full of novelties for him. The camels, the foreign languages, the appearance of the Sogdian merchants whose clothing and physical features are different from anything he grew up around. Buddhism itself, the faith that is sending him on this westward journey, came to China from exactly this direction, carried by monks and merchants along these same roads 5 centuries before, and there is something symbolically appropriate about the fact that Zhang is now moving westward along a road still traveled by the descendants of the same Central Asian peoples who first brought his faith to China. The fire crackles and settles, sending a brief shower of sparks upward into the dark. Somewhere beyond the inn's walls, out on the road, there is the distant sound of hooves. A rider moving quickly, too quickly for someone looking for a place to stop. And then silence again. The night is profoundly quiet in the way that the landscape of the Gansu corridor is profoundly quiet. There are no villages immediately nearby, no sounds of human habitation other than this inn itself. And the dark outside the gate is a complete, unbroken dark, without any of the ambient light glow that a modern person would take for granted. The mountains to the south are invisible, absorbed into the darkness, but you know they are there from the way the wind comes down off them, cold and faintly mineral-smelling like stone and snowmelt. This kind of darkness is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most fundamental differences between the world of 800 AD and the world we inhabit today. After dark, the world contracted dramatically. You moved by torchlight or lantern if you had to move at all, but the overwhelming tendency, the deeply ingrained human habit of every society before the industrial age, was to be inside after dark. The sun set and the world became a different place, quieter, smaller, more intimate, organized around the small circles of light that individual fires and oil lamps created. The inn's courtyard fire was a communal hearth in the most ancient sense, drawing people toward it, not only for warmth, but for the psychological comfort of light and company against the surrounding dark. Liu Wei begins to tell a story. This too is part of his function as innkeeper. He is a repository of the tales of the road, a man who has heard hundreds of travelers' accounts of what lies ahead and behind, and who has learned to tell the best of them in a way that keeps tired people awake around a fire. The story he tells tonight is about a merchant from Persia. A man who came through this very inn, he says, about 3 years ago with a caravan of extraordinary horses. These were not ordinary travel horses, but animals of the finest Fergana bloodline, bred in the stud farms of the western oases and intended for sale to the Tang imperial stables in Chang'an. There were 12 of them, each one a different color, and they were so beautiful, Liu Wei says, that when they stopped in the courtyard, all the other travelers came out of their rooms just to look. The Persian merchant, he continues, told him that these horses had been blessed by a Zoroastrian priest in Samarkand before the journey began, each one anointed on the forehead with sacred fire ash, and that this blessing was why they had survived the crossing of the desert without losing a single animal, which was almost unheard of. Liu Wei himself is a Buddhist in the practical, syncretic way of many Tang period Chinese. He keeps a small altar in the corner of his kitchen with a clay figure of Guanyin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, and he burns a stick of incense before it each morning. But he tells the story of the Zoroastrian blessing with respect and without skepticism, because one of the things that running an inn on the Silk Road teaches you is that the world contains many varieties of truth and many ways of approaching the divine. And a man who has seen Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christian priests, Islamic scholars, and Zoroastrian merchants all arrive tired and hungry at his gate and all leave satisfied, has a naturally ecumenical relationship with questions of religion. Nestorian Christianity, which Liu Wei has encountered in the form of travelers who stop and pray quietly in the corner of the courtyard before eating, is one of the more remarkable stories of Tang period religious history. Nestorianism, a form of Christianity that had been declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD and subsequently expelled from the Byzantine world, had travelled east along the Silk Road and established itself across Central Asia and into China with quiet persistence. In Chang'an, there was a Nestorian church, built in 635 AD with the permission of Emperor Taizong, and a stele, a tall stone monument, had been erected in 781 AD to commemorate the arrival of this faith in China, inscribed in both Chinese and Syriac. Nestorian communities existed as far east as what is now Xi'an, and as far as the Tang period knew, they extended west into the heart of the Sasanian, and later the Islamic world, a thread of a particular theological tradition woven through the entire width of Eurasia. The Salt official, Master Chen, has heard Liu Wei's horse story before, or one very much like it, and he listens with the patient expression of a man who appreciates a good story even when he knows how it ends. He adds a detail of his own. He once saw a display of Fergana horses at the imperial stables in Luoyang, the eastern capital, and the animals were extraordinary, much larger than Chinese-bred horses, with longer necks and a different floating gait, and so beautiful that the grooms had tied silk ribbons into their manes. The Tang court's obsession with these Western horses was long-standing and intense. The great Tang poet Du Fu, writing in the previous generation, had composed a famous series of poems about a painting of imperial horses that treated the horses as beings of almost supernatural magnificence. The fire burns lower. One by one, the people around it begin to drift toward their rooms. The Sogdian merchants go first. They are up before dawn, they say, because they want to reach the next way station before the afternoon heat sets in, even though the season means there is no real afternoon heat to worry about. The early start is simply habit, the deeply ingrained schedule of experienced long-distance travelers for whom time on the road is money. They bid good night in a mixture of languages, a phrase in Chinese, a Sogdian word or two, a gesture, and disappear through their door. Master Chen follows soon after, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has drunk just enough rice wine to make his legs slightly uncertain. He bows to Liu Wei with the formal politeness of a government official acknowledging a registered innkeeper, a small social nicety that Liu Wei returns with equal formality and which both men seem to find satisfying, the way people find satisfaction in small rituals properly observed. His candle, visible for a moment through his door, before he closes it, makes a brief rectangle of orange in the dark wall of the courtyard, and then disappears. Young Zhang is the last to leave the fire. He sits for a while after the others have gone, watching the coals, his hands wrapped around the last of his tea. He is thinking about Dunhuang, perhaps, or about home, or about the 1,000 miles of road still ahead of him, or about the particular sutra he has been memorizing during the long walking hours of the day, reciting it to himself in rhythm with his footsteps. Buddhist practice in this period put enormous emphasis on the physical act of memorization, not just learning something intellectually, but having it live in the body so that it could be recalled without effort, the words arising naturally in moments of meditation or distress. The road itself could be a form of practice, the rhythmic walking, the repetitive landscape, the physical exhaustion that burned away distraction and left the mind cleaner, more receptive. Eventually, Zhang rises, bows briefly in the direction of the main building, a small act of courtesy toward Liu Wei, who may or may not be watching from the kitchen door, and goes to his room. Liu Wei himself stays up a little longer, banking the fire, checking that the stable boy has properly secured the animals, walking the perimeter of the courtyard in the quiet way of a man who has been responsible for this space for so long that checking it at night has become as automatic as breathing. He checks the gate, still open because the night is not yet late enough to close it, and a traveller arriving in the next hour or two should find it open. And he stands at the gate for a moment, looking out at the dark road. The road at night has a different quality than the road by day. By day, it is busy, purposeful, full of movement and noise and the specific weight of human intention. By night, it is empty and still, and it seems to extend much further, as though the dark has stretched it. Liu Wei has stood at this gate on thousands of evenings and watched the darkness, and he knows every sound the road makes at night, the distant bark of a dog in a village 2 li away, the sound of the wind in the tamarisk bushes that grow along the road's margin, the occasional cry of an owl hunting in the scrubland. Tonight there is nothing unusual, and he turns back inside with the satisfaction of a man whose world is in order. Inside, the inn is mostly quiet. Through the thin walls he can hear the sounds of his guests sleeping, or not sleeping, as the case may be. One of the Sogdian merchants snores with a deep, regular rumble that has the quality of something geological. In another room, the salt official is coughing quietly, the dry cough of a man with a chest complaint that the autumn air has aggravated. And from Zhang's room there is a faint murmuring, rhythmic and soft, that Liu Wei recognizes after a moment as sutra recitation. The young monk is still at his practice, whispering the words of the Dharma into the dark of his small room as the inn settles around him. Let's stay in this moment for a while, because the night is still young and there is much to understand about this world. The room that has been assigned to you is small, perhaps 10 feet by 8 feet, with walls of the same rammed earth as the exterior, whitewashed on the inside with lime, the whitewash slightly yellowed and marked with the handprints and smudges of countless previous guests. The sleeping mat is thick cotton stuffed with raw cotton batting, spread on a raised platform of packed clay. The kang, a heated sleeping surface used throughout northern China, where a channel runs beneath the clay and connects to the kitchen fire, so that the residual heat from cooking warms the sleeping platform through the night. This ingenious arrangement means that even when the air temperature in the room drops near freezing, the surface you sleep on is warm, and the trick is to burrow down into the heavy cotton quilts that Liu Wei's wife has piled onto the mat, and let the warmth of the kang work upward through the layers of fabric. The oil lamp in your room is a simple clay saucer with a wick made of twisted cloth, burning vegetable oil. Hemp oil, most likely, or sesame oil, both of which were widely available in this region. The flame is small and soft, barely bright enough to read by, and it casts everything in the room in a warm, slightly unsteady light that makes the shadows on the whitewashed walls shift and move like slow, gentle things. On the low table beside the mat there is a ceramic water cup, a small bronze mirror that is a permanent fixture of the room rather than a personal belonging, and a stick of incense in a clay holder. Liu Wei provides incense in each room as a matter of course, both for the pleasant smell and because many of his guests, whether Buddhist or of other faiths, like to burn a stick of incense before sleeping as a form of prayer or simple ritual. The incense is sandalwood most likely, since sandalwood was the most common and affordable aromatic wood in Tang China. The trade in aromatic substances, sandalwood, camphor, frankincense, musk, aloe wood, cloves, was one of the significant economic threads of the Silk Road world, and the scents of these substances were woven into the fabric of Tang culture in ways that are hard to fully imagine from a modern perspective. Incense burned in temples and in private homes, in court ceremonies and in funeral rites, in the act of opening a sutra and in the private moments before sleep. The smell of burning incense was the smell of the sacred, the smell of attention being paid to something beyond the immediate material world. Let us talk now about the broader context of this night, about what the world of 800 AD looked like on the map, and what it felt like to be alive within it. The Tang Dynasty in 800 AD was recovering from a trauma that had nearly destroyed it. The Anlushan Rebellion, which began in 755 AD under the military governor Anlushan, a man of Sogdian and Turkic ancestry, interestingly, a product of the very Silk Road world that is our subject, had ripped the empire apart. Anlushan had controlled the northeastern military commands, had built his personal army into one of the most powerful forces in the empire, and had marched on Chang'an with an army that swept aside everything in its path. The Tang Emperor Xuanzong had been forced to flee the capital in a disaster that became one of the defining episodes of Chinese cultural memory. The rebellion had taken years and the assistance of Uyghur Turkic allies to suppress, and its aftermath left the dynasty weakened, the frontier garrisons undermanned, and the great cosmopolitan confidence of the early Tang somewhat shaken. The Silk Road had suffered during the rebellion as well. The Tang had lost effective control of the western frontier zones, the Tarim Basin oases that connected China to Central Asia, to Tibetan expansion in the 760s and 770s. Dunhuang itself, the great cave temple complex toward which young Zhang is traveling, had been under Tibetan control from roughly 781 until 848, meaning that at the precise moment of our story, in 800 AD, Zhang is traveling toward a city that is not under Tang administration. This is not unusual for the Silk Road world, which was always a patchwork of different political authorities. The road itself was stronger than any particular political arrangement, and merchants and pilgrims continued to move through politically contested zones simply because commerce and faith had their own imperatives that were largely separate from the concerns of emperors and military governors. The Tibetan Empire at this moment was at the height of its own power and expansion, a fact that would surprise many people today, accustomed to thinking of Tibet as a small, isolated plateau kingdom. In 800 AD, Tibet was a major Central Asian power that controlled a huge territory, maintained diplomatic relations with the Tang court, the Islamic Caliphate, and the kingdoms of Nepal and northern India, and had produced a significant Buddhist cultural tradition of its own. The Tibetan relationship with Tang China was complex, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, occasionally warm, and it was one of the defining geopolitical axes of the 8th and 9th century Asian world. To the west, The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, founded in 750 AD on the ruins of the Umayyad Caliphate, was reaching its own cultural and intellectual peak. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, of Arabian Nights fame, had died in 809 AD, so he is alive and reigning at the moment of our story, and his court in Baghdad was one of the great centers of learning in the world. The House of Wisdom, the Bayt al-Hikmah, was translating Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, building the foundation of what would become the great Islamic scientific tradition of the medieval world. Silk from China reached Baghdad. Chinese papermaking techniques, captured from Chinese craftsmen, taken prisoner after the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, had been introduced into the Islamic world and were beginning the slow westward spread of paper that would eventually transform European intellectual life. Closer to our inn, the intermediate world of Central Asia was a complex, layered place. The Uyghur Khaganate controlled the steppe regions to the north of the road. The Tang had a complicated, dependent relationship with the Uyghurs. They had needed Uyghur military help to suppress the An Lushan rebellion, and this help had been paid for partly in silk and partly in political concessions that left the Tang somewhat in the Uyghurs' debt. Uyghur merchants were active throughout the Tang commercial world, and their presence in Tang cities, including in Chang'an, was significant enough to create both cultural richness and occasional diplomatic friction. In the oasis cities strung along the Silk Road west of Dunhuang, Turfan, Kucha, Khotan, Kashgar, there were mixed populations of Sogdians, Uyghurs, Tocharians, the mysterious Indo-European people who had been there for centuries, and various other groups all living in close proximity to each other, trading, intermarrying, borrowing each other's artistic traditions, arguing about theology, and producing the extraordinary multicultural material culture that modern archaeologists have been excavating and studying for more than a century. Back in the inn, as the night deepens, Liu Wei has finally gone to bed. He sleeps in a small room off the kitchen next to his wife, with their two youngest children piled onto the kang beside them in the way that families sleep when space is limited and winters are cold. He falls asleep quickly, the way people who do physical work fall asleep, completely and without ceremony, and his breathing becomes the deep, regular breathing of a man at rest. The stable boy, whose name is Xiao Ding, Little Ding, is technically supposed to stay awake through the night to watch the animals, but he has made a nest for himself in the hay beside the camels and is deeply asleep, his young face slack and peaceful, his breathing audible in the quiet of the stable. The animals themselves are not fully asleep. Horses sleep in short bursts, often standing, and the 3 horses in the courtyard are in various states of doze and light wakefulness, their eyes half closed, their ears occasionally rotating towards some sound in the darkness. The camels have folded themselves down onto their knees with the boneless-seeming ease of animals built for this posture and are chewing their cuds in a slow, meditative rhythm. They are not uncomfortable. They have slept in far worse places than this courtyard, in open desert with the stars overhead and the sand still warm from the day's sun, in the courtyards of much more primitive establishments than this one, in the open during rainstorms. The courtyard of Liu Wei's inn is, by their standards, luxury. Out on the road, perhaps half an hour after Liu Wei has gone to bed, there is the sound of a new arrival. Hoofbeats, unhurried but purposeful, and then the creak of the gate as someone pushes it open and leads a horse inside. Xiao Ding wakes with a start. He has been trained to this, and scrambles out of his hay nest. The arrival is a government courier, identifiable by the leather satchel marked with the official seal that is slung across his body, and by the urgency that seems to radiate from him even at this hour, even in the quiet of the courtyard. He needs to water his horse and take a fresh one if available, and he needs whatever food can be produced quickly. he is not staying the night. Liu Wei, roused by the sounds. He sleeps with one ear perpetually attuned to the courtyard, another innkeeper's professional habit, appears in the kitchen doorway within a minute, pulling his robe around him. He assesses the courier quickly, confirms that there is indeed a fresh horse available, and while Xiao Ding begins the work of unsaddling the courier's exhausted animal and bridling the replacement, Auntie Zhao appears and begins assembling food. Flatbread, a wedge of hard cheese, dried apricots, all wrapped in a cloth and handed over in less time than it takes to describe. The courier eats standing, one hand on the horse's bridle, chewing quickly, and is gone inside 15 minutes, the sound of his hoofbeats receding into the dark with a speed that suggests the message he is carrying is urgent. Liu Wei watches him go, then turns back inside without comment. Government couriers were a feature of this world, and their movements had nothing to do with him except as a source of small, reliable income. The government paid a standard rate for relay station services provided by registered inns when official way stations were not available. He notes the transaction in the mental ledger he keeps, a notation that will eventually become a written entry in the inn's accounts register, which will eventually find its way into the records of the local government office, and goes back to bed. The night continues. Let us move around the inn through these small hours and look at what is happening in each of the rooms. In the room nearest the stable, one of the Sogdian merchants is not, in fact, sleeping, despite the earliness of his intended start. He is lying on his mat in the dark, and he is thinking. He is thinking about money, specifically about the price of the glass flask he showed his companion earlier, and about the price he expects to get for it in Chang'an, and about the various complications that stand between the flask and its destination, the customs duty that will be assessed at the next official checkpoint, the commission that will need to be paid to the Sogdian community agent in Chang'an who will help him find buyers, and the unpredictable fluctuation in the luxury goods market that might mean the price he is expecting turns out to be higher or lower than he anticipates. Merchant arithmetic is not glamorous, but it is the mechanism by which the Silk Road functioned, and he does it the way all experienced traders do, constantly, automatically, even in the dark before sleep. His name is Nanai Vandak, a Sogdian name that incorporates the name of the god Nana, a deity of Central Asian origin who was worshipped across the Silk Road world. He is a second-generation merchant. His father made the same route before him and taught him the road the way a craftsman teaches his craft, by example and repetition, by walking it together until the distances and the way stations and the names of reliable innkeepers were as familiar as the streets of his hometown. He carries with him, in the leather satchel that goes everywhere with him, and that he sleeps with his arm through the strap, a collection of documents, contracts, letters of credit, receipts, a letter of introduction from the Sogdian community leader in Dunhuang, a small list of names and prices that is the current intelligence he has gathered about the Chang'an luxury market. These documents are his working tools, as essential to his trade as a carpenter's chisels are to his. Nanai Vandak also carries in a separate small pouch inside his clothing a collection of items that might be described as personal and religious. A fire altar amulet small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, made of cast bronze in the form of the Zoroastrian sacred fire and worn since his adolescence as a continuous protective presence. A folded piece of cloth with the handwriting of his mother on it. The end of a letter she sent him 3 years ago, the part where she described the spring festival in the home village, which he has kept because reading it makes him feel less far from home. A lock of his daughter's hair tied with a red thread given to him when he left on this journey. These small personal relics are universal human things belonging to no culture and no period. The working Silk Road merchant with the fire altar and the lock of his child's hair is not so different from a modern person with a photograph in their wallet. In another room, Master Chen is awake as well, lying on his back and staring at the darkness above him. He is 53 years old, a fact he is thinking about tonight, because today was his birthday. A fact he told nobody, because marking one's birthday as an occasion was not, in Tang, China, the cultural convention it has become in the modern world, and he would have found it embarrassing to mention. He has spent most of his adult life in the service of the government salt administration, an institution of enormous importance in Tang economic life. Salt was a government monopoly, one of the primary sources of imperial revenue, and managing its production, transportation, and distribution was a major bureaucratic enterprise. The salt official's role was unglamorous but essential, and because salt money was large money, potentially lucrative for the dishonest and steadily comfortable for the honest, which Master Chen was. He is thinking tonight about retirement. He has served the required years. He has the rank that entitles him to a pension. His wife is waiting in Luoyang, in the house they have lived in for 20 years, and his children are grown and gone. A daughter married into a merchant family in Yangzhou, a son working in the capital as a junior official in the Department of State Affairs. There is nothing, in theory, stopping him from stopping, and yet he has not stopped. Every year he tells himself this will be the last posting, and every year some new emergency presents itself, a discrepancy in the accounts that needs investigating, a quarrel between a salt merchant and a depot manager that requires senior adjudication, and he finds himself once again on the road, once again in an inn, once again lying in the dark of an unfamiliar room, listening to the sounds of other people's sleep. He knows, if he is honest with himself, that the road has become his home in a way that the house in Luoyang never quite managed to be. He knows the inns better than he knows his own garden. He knows the quality of the millet grown in Gansu versus the millet grown in Henan, because he has eaten both in hundreds of different inns for decades. He knows the names of innkeepers and garrison commanders and salt depot managers across a territory that spans 1,000 miles. He is, in the fullest sense, a man of the road, and retirement is a word that describes a geography he no longer fully inhabits. Across the courtyard, in the room closest to the gate, the young monk Zhang has finally stopped his sutra recitation and fallen into a light, restless sleep. He dreams, and the dreams are vivid, as the dreams of tired young people in new places tend to be. He dreams of the caves at Dunhuang, though he has never seen them, constructing them from the descriptions he has been given and the paintings of cave temples he has seen in monasteries at home. In his dream, the caves are larger than life, each one a vast chamber filled with golden light, the murals on the walls moving slightly, the bodhisattvas in the paintings turning their heads to look at him as he walks past. In his dream, there is music, the deep, resonant music of monastery bells and the smell of incense so strong it is almost a taste. Zhang is 17 years old. He was sent on this journey by the abbot of the monastery, where he has been in training since the age of 10, selected because he was the best student of his generation at that monastery, the one most likely to benefit from study at Dunhuang's libraries and to bring back texts and knowledge that would benefit the whole community. He carries letters of introduction from his abbot to the senior monks at Dunhuang, a small amount of money for expenses, a change of clothing, and a wooden traveling case containing the few sutras he has already learned, and a writing brush and inkstone for copying texts. He has been walking for 3 weeks. He will walk for several more weeks before he arrives. He is lonely, he is often frightened in ways he would not admit to anyone, and he is also, in his best moments, suffused with a sense of rightness about what he is doing, a sense that this journey is exactly what he is supposed to be doing, that every step is a step in the right direction. The monastery that Zhang is traveling to was also a center of artistic production of extraordinary significance. The painters who worked at Mogao in this period were among the finest artists of the Tang world, working in a tradition that drew on Chinese, Indian, Central Asian, and even Hellenistic artistic influences to produce images of remarkable power and beauty. The bodhisattvas in the Mogao murals have the elongated, graceful bodies of Indian Buddhist art and the specific facial types of Tang Chinese painting, dressed in the elaborate bejeweled costumes of the Tang court, their poses deriving ultimately from the sculptural traditions of the Gandharan workshops of northwestern Pakistan. These paintings were not made in isolation or as purely religious exercises. They were the product of an intensely cosmopolitan artistic culture that was simultaneously drawing on and contributing to a visual tradition that stretched from the Mediterranean to Japan. The silk that funded much of this artistic production was still moving through the inn where Zhang sleeps. Silk as currency, silk as gift, silk as tribute payment, silk as the primary commodity of the Tang trade system. Silk was woven through every aspect of the economic and political life of this world. The Tang government paid its officials partly in silk. Treaties were sealed with silk gifts. The Uyghur Shogunate had extracted enormous quantities of silk from the Tang court as payment for military assistance. Buddhist monasteries received silk donations from wealthy patrons and used it both as temple decoration and as a trade good to fund their operations. The Sogdian merchants, like Nanai Vandak, specialized partly in silk trade, carrying Chinese silk west and returning with the luxury goods the Tang market craved. Let us go further back in the evening's history to a few hours before our story began and consider the day that led to this night. Nanai Vandak and his partner Varazdad, the younger Sogdian, named for an ancient Arsacid Persian king, had set out from the previous inn before dawn and had been traveling for 12 hours by the time they reached Liu Wei's establishment. Their route had taken them along the southern edge of the Gansu corridor, with the Kilian Mountains rising to their left and the gravel desert stretching to their right through a landscape that is technically extreme, harsh, dry, climatically challenging, but that is also in certain lights and seasons extraordinarily beautiful. The mountains in autumn catch the last of the season's sun on their slopes and turn the rocks and sparse vegetation into a palette of amber and ochre and deep red that is quite different from the dusty grey-brown monotony of the desert floor. They had stopped at midday beside a small spring, one of the oases that made this route possible, where underground water coming off the mountains reached the surface and allowed a small patch of vegetation to exist, and had eaten their noon meal there. Dried meat, flatbread, dried apricots, water from the spring tasted with a slightly mineral edge that spoke of the limestone geology of the mountains. Varazdad had used the stop to inspect their goods, checking that the glass flask was unbroken, that the rolls of finished silk they were transporting were properly wrapped against the dust and damp, that the locked iron chest that contained their liquid capital in coin was still properly secured. The inspection was partly practical and partly ritual, the working traveller's equivalent of checking one's mental state. Am I still intact? Yes. Then we continue. The camels had knelt to drink from the spring and had risen again with their characteristic unhurried dignity. Bactrian camels are among the most extraordinary transport animals ever domesticated, perfectly adapted to exactly the conditions of the Silk Road. They can go for days without water, their broad padded feet manage soft sand and gravel alike, their thick double coat handles both the extreme cold of winter desert nights and the heat of summer days, and their calm, stoic temperament makes them manageable by a single handler, even in difficult conditions. The Silk Road as a historical phenomenon would have been significantly different, perhaps impossible at scale, without the Bactrian camel. The road itself in this section of the Gansu corridor was clearly defined. Generations of use had packed the earth hard and worn a track that was visible from a distance as a slight depression in the desert pavement, a darker line in the pale grey gravel. Along its margins here and there were the remnants of older use, the broken sherds of a ceramic vessel that had slipped from a pack animal's load decades or centuries ago and lay where it fell, too far from any settlement to be worth collecting. The bones of a horse, bleached and separated by wind and time, the skull facing east as though looking toward home. A carved stone marker, its inscription worn almost to illegibility by wind-borne grit that might once have named a distance or a direction, or a deceased traveller whose family had placed it here in lieu of a grave. The afternoon had brought a change in the weather, a wind coming in off the desert to the north, cold and carrying a fine grit that found its way into eyes and mouth and clothing, no matter how carefully you tried to keep it out. Nanai Vandak had pulled his headscarf up over his lower face in the way he had learned years ago to do when the desert wind came and they had simply pushed through it because there was no alternative. The wind was not dangerous, not today, but it was exhausting, the constant physical pressure of it against your body and the gritty discomfort of it against your skin. When they saw the lantern of Liu Wei's inn in the early dusk, both men had felt the particular, almost emotional relief that comes from seeing shelter after a hard day's travel. Master Chen's day had been different. He had travelled with a small government escort. 2 guards from the Lanzhou garrison assigned to accompany him to his inspection destination and back, and they had moved more slowly than the merchants, the salt official's horse setting a deliberate pace that spoke of a man who was not in a hurry because he had arrived at the point in life where hurrying produces no net benefit. He had spent the morning reading documents in his saddlebag, reports from the previous salt depot inspection that he had been meaning to review, held together with a red cord and rubber-stamped with the seal of the Lanzhou Salt Administration. The reports were, as government reports tend to be, a mixture of genuine information and carefully constructed narrative designed to make the authors look competent and the problems look manageable. Chen had been in this business long enough to know how to read between the lines of an official report. The figure given for salt output was probably accurate to within 10%. Salt was too easily measured for significant falsification. The figure given for transport costs was probably inflated by 15 to 20%, which was the customary amount of padding that depot managers allowed themselves as a kind of informal compensation for the low official salaries the government paid. The report on the condition of the storage facilities was probably accurate because anyone falsifying it would have to answer for the discrepancy when he arrived and saw the facilities with his own eyes. He had marked the relevant sections with small notations in the margin in the cramped, efficient handwriting that decades of document work had produced, and had tied the reports back up and returned them to his saddlebag. Young Zhang's day had been the day of a pilgrim. Steady walking, beginning at dawn, a rhythm established in the first hour that continued, more or less unchanged, until the light began to fail and he started looking for accommodation. He had been reciting sutras as he walked, the Diamond Sutra, which he had been working to memorize for the past year, and the Heart Sutra, which he knew by heart already and could recite as automatically as breathing. The Diamond Sutra is one of the most philosophically sophisticated texts in the Buddhist canon, a series of dialogues between the Buddha and his disciple Subhuti that circle around the nature of reality, the illusory quality of perception, and the nature of the bodhisattva ideal. Walking a road in northwestern China with mountains to your left and desert to your right, while reciting a text about the illusory nature of forms, is, in a certain light, a very fitting thing to do. Zhang had passed, during his day's walk, through a small garrison town, just a wall and a gate and a few buildings inside, the permanent garrison of a few dozen soldiers whose job was to maintain the security of this section of the road. He had stopped there long enough to fill his water jug and buy a handful of dried dates from a woman selling them outside the gate, and he had registered himself with the garrison records office in the required way, presenting his travel documents and watching as a bored soldier wrote his name and destination in a ledger that was already thick with similar entries. The soldier had looked at his Buddhist monk's robe and said, without much expression, that he had passed 3 other monks going the same direction in the past week. Zhang had nodded and thanked him and continued. Those other monks, 3 other young men on the same journey, their names unknown to him, were ahead of him on the road somewhere. Perhaps they would arrive at Dunhuang around the same time he did, and they would meet in the monastery compound and discover they had been walking the same road a few days apart, and this would be the beginning of a friendship or a scholarly relationship that would last for decades. Or perhaps they would arrive at different times and never meet. The road produces such coincidences in abundance, and it is one of the defining features of the pilgrimage experience, this awareness of other people on the same journey, ahead and behind, all moving toward the same destination by the same route, connected by the path itself, even without knowing each other. Now it is the deep middle of the night. The inn is at its most settled. All the guests who are going to sleep are sleeping, and the next guests who might arrive are still hours away. The fire in the courtyard has burned down to a few red embers that give almost no light, just a faint warmth that is more symbolic than practical. The oil lamp in your room has burned down too, and you can let it go out now. The candle is not needed for anything, and the darkness is comfortable. The darkness of a room with thick walls and a heavy quilt, and the warmth of the kang working upward through the mat. This is the hour when the Silk Road itself seems most present, not as a commercial artery or a geopolitical route or historical concept, but as a physical thing, a strip of worn earth stretching in both directions into the dark, connecting this small, warm inn to an enormous, complex world. 2,000 miles to the west in Baghdad, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid might be awake, conducting the late-night meetings that history suggests he favored, or reading the translation of some Greek medical text that a Nestorian scholar has brought to the House of Wisdom, or listening to the poetry of Abu Nuwas, his court poet. 300 miles to the east, in the monastery where Zhang grew up, an old monk is performing the midnight prayer service in a dimly lit hall, the incense smoke rising through lamplight. And here, in between, in this small inn on the Gansu corridor, a handful of tired people are sleeping through the night that connects one day's travel to the next. The history of the Silk Road is sometimes told as though it were primarily the history of goods, as a story of silk going west and glass coming east, of spices and horses and precious metals moving along a set of routes driven by price differentials and market demands. And that history is real and important, but the Silk Road was also the history of people sleeping in inns like this one, eating mutton stew, banking their fires, telling stories, doing commercial arithmetic in the dark. It was the history of young monks memorizing sutras. It was the history of innkeepers who learned the names and sounds of the road so well that they could tell from the sound of approaching hoofbeats whether the arrival was a courier or a merchant or a soldier. It was the history of the specific texture of rammed earth under whitewash and the smell of sesame oil burning in a clay lamp and the weight of a heavy cotton quilt on a cold night. One of the things that makes the Tang Dynasty such a fertile subject for this kind of immersive history is the survival of primary sources. The Dunhuang manuscripts, sealed in their cave in the late 10th or early 11th century, and not opened again until 1900, contain thousands of documents that give us an intimate, ground-level view of life in this world. There are contracts for the hire of donkeys, There are letters home from soldiers at distant garrisons complaining about the food and the climate and asking for winter clothing. There are medical prescriptions written in the cramped hand of a doctor who was treating patients right here in the Gansu corridor. There are accounts, ledgers, calendars, dictionaries, lists of inn prices, records of camel sales, and a remarkable collection of popular literature, stories, songs, ballads, that circulated among the literate and semi-literate population of the road rather than the elite literary culture of the capital. One of the Dunhuang documents that historians find particularly evocative is a list of topics for teaching children how to write, essentially a primer, a list of things children were expected to be able to write about, things that were considered the basic furniture of a literate person's world in this time and place. The list includes the names of grains and vegetables, the names of animals, the parts of a wagon, the names of tools, the procedures for basic medical treatments, the proper forms of address for different social relationships, and, of particular interest for our purposes tonight, the conventions of inn life, how to address an innkeeper, what to expect to pay for different categories of accommodation, how to register properly with garrison records offices, the proper etiquette for sharing a meal with travelers of different status. This is a world in which inn life was considered basic knowledge, something a literate person needed to understand the way a literate person today might be expected to understand how to use public transportation or navigate a bureaucratic form. The night is not entirely silent. From somewhere in the distance, it is difficult to tell how far. There is the sound of dogs barking, a chain of barks running from one dog to the next, the way sound travels in a quiet night, each dog responding to the alarm of the one before it. Something has moved through the edge of a settlement, a fox perhaps, or a wolf, or simply a traveler on the road after dark who has disturbed a dog's sense of territorial security. The barking runs its course and dies away, and the silence reasserts itself. Inside the inn, Auntie Zhao is awake. She often is at this hour. She has a child who is teething, the youngest of their 3 children, a girl of about 14 months, who wakes irregularly through the night with the discomfort that teething produces and requires comfort before she will sleep again. Auntie Zhao picks the child up without fully waking herself, in the expert somnambulant way that experienced parents learn to do, and settles the baby against her body and sways slightly, and the child's cry subsides and becomes a soft, snuffling sleep breath, and Auntie Zhao lowers herself back onto the mat without fully regaining consciousness herself. She is, at 40 years old, a woman of considerable competence and relatively little recognition, which was the standard condition for women running commercial establishments in Tang, China, where the commercial and social credit accrued primarily to the male proprietor, even when the practical management was substantially shared or even female-dominated. Auntie Zhao runs the kitchen, which is the heart of the inn. She manages the supply chain that keeps the kitchen stocked, negotiating with farmers and merchants who come to the door selling produce. She supervises the domestic labor of the inn, which includes the laundry, the maintenance of the sleeping mats, the preparation of incense, and the management of the stable boy. She can read, which was not universal among women of her class, and she keeps the kitchen accounts in a small notebook that she guards with a quiet possessiveness that Liu Wei has learned not to question. Her Sichuan origin, which Liu Wei boasts of to guests as a guarantee of culinary quality, is genuine. She grew up in a city in the Sichuan basin, the daughter of a cook who worked in a prosperous restaurant, and she learned to cook the way she learned to walk, by immersion, from infancy, in a kitchen that smelled of chili oil and fermented black beans and the particular clean, bright smell of the mountain vegetables that grow in the Sichuan highlands. She came to the northwest when she was 22, following a first marriage that ended unhappily and a second chance that appeared in the form of Liu Wei, who was looking for a cook, and found himself also looking for a wife, and had the good sense to recognize that he had found both in the same person. The mutton stew that she made tonight, which the guests received without particular comment because it was simply good food served in a roadside inn, was the product of a skill that had been refined over nearly 20 years of cooking for travelers. The art of making mutton palatable. Mutton is a strong flavored meat, gamey in a way that can be off-putting if the cooking is careless, was something she had worked at seriously through experiment and failure and gradual improvement. The star anise she used was from a merchant who stopped here once a year on his way south from Lanzhou, a spice trader whose route took him through the northern Silk Road corridor and who carried the fragrant dried spice in cloth bags that perfumed everything around them. The dried chilies came from further east, from Henan province, traded along the secondary networks of the agricultural hinterland. Good food on the road was not something that travelers took for granted. The quality of inn cooking varied enormously, and experienced travelers had opinions about specific inns the way modern travelers have opinions about specific restaurants. The Dunhuang documents include letters that mention in passing the quality of food at particular inns. This place has good mutton, that place charges too much for inferior millet. The inn at the third relay station west of Dunhuang is clean, and the proprietor honest. This kind of informal intelligence moved through the traveler network continuously, shaping where people stopped and where they did not. Let us imagine now that we can briefly leave the courtyard of Liu Wei's inn and rise above it, not very far, just high enough to see the whole structure from above in the darkness. The inn from above looks like a square of dim light in a very large darkness, the faint glow of the few remaining oil lamps visible as tiny points through the thin membrane of the walls, the courtyard open to the sky and showing the red ember of the dying fire. Around it the road stretches in both directions, a pale line visible in the starlight. And tonight there are stars, because the sky has cleared and the air is dry, and the stars above the Gansu corridor on a clear autumn night are extraordinary. More stars than most people who live under modern light-polluted skies have ever seen. The Milky Way not a smear, but a river, dense and bright, crossing the sky from horizon to horizon. The road and the stars were navigation tools in this world. A traveler who knew the sky could orient himself on a clear night without any other reference. The pole star, constant and bright due north, the seasonal positions of major constellations telling the time of year, the movement of the planets through the zodiac providing a kind of cosmic calendar that every educated person was expected to understand. Astrology and astronomy were not yet separated in this world. The same knowledge that let you navigate by stars also let you, if you believed in such things, read the fates of dynasties and individuals in the movements of celestial bodies. The Tang court employed astronomers, astrologers, and calendar makers in substantial numbers, and the calendar they produced, adjusted and revised regularly to keep it accurate, was one of the primary instruments of imperial legitimacy, since the right to issue the calendar was one of the markers of legitimate political authority. The night is at its coldest now, that particular cold that comes in the hours before dawn, when the earth has given up the last of the day's stored heat, and the sun is still too far away to begin warming it again. In the stable, the camels have moved slightly closer together, sharing warmth with a quiet practicality that is one of the endearing qualities of these animals. The horses are dozing. The stable boy Xiao Ding has burrowed deeper into his hay so that only the top of his head is visible, and he looks very young, which he is, 12 or 13, old enough to be given a working role in the inn, but not old enough to maintain a watch through an entire night, and Liu Wei has never seriously expected him to. Xiao Ding's job is not really to watch through the night, but to be present and accessible, to respond to sounds, and to take care of the animals at dawn when the early starting travelers need their mounts ready. The moon, if there is a moon tonight, let's say there is a crescent, a thin pale arc in the western sky, is setting now, dipping toward the horizon. Its light has been barely enough to add anything to the darkness, a faint silver edge on the inn's roofline, a slight luminescence to the pale gravel of the road. As it sets, the darkness deepens briefly, and then your eyes adjust to the pure starlight, which is its own kind of illumination. Not enough to read by or to do any work, but enough to see the shapes of things, the outline of buildings against the sky, the distant mountains' silhouette. The hour before dawn is the deepest part of the night, the point at which sleep is most complete and the world is most quiet, and it is also the hour at which the early travelers begin to stir. In this inn, as in every Silk Road inn, the process of preparation for the day's travel begins earlier than you might expect. The Sogdian merchants had said they would be up before dawn, and they are true to this intention. Nanai Vandak is awake first, as he usually is, roused by an internal clock set to the rhythms of decades of early travel. He dresses in the dark, using his fingers to find the fastenings of his clothing, and he is dressed and checking his saddlebags before any light has appeared in the eastern sky. His companion Varazdad wakes at the sound of movement, slightly less willingly. He is younger and sleeps more deeply, but he too rises and begins the quick, efficient process of assembling his travelling kit. Their room leaves no evidence of their presence within 5 minutes of their rising. The mats restored to their folded state against the wall, the water cup returned to the table, the door latched behind them. They are professionals of the road in the most complete sense. They leave no trace. In the courtyard, they find Xiao Ding already up. He has been woken by their movement, by the particular sensitivity to sound that comes from sleeping in a place where it is his job to respond to sounds, and already beginning the work of preparing the camels. The camels kneel on command with a grumbling protest that is not genuine but habitual, and Varazdad begins the work of loading the packs while Nanai Vandak checks the animals' feet for any signs of injury or lameness that might have developed overnight. This is not ceremony. An injured camel on the Silk Road is a serious problem, and a good merchant checks his animals every morning before loading them. Liu Wei appears. He has been sleeping lightly enough to wake at the first sounds of preparation, with a small lamp and a bowl of warm porridge for each of them, because he knows from long experience that merchants who leave before dawn are hungry merchants, and feeding them a proper breakfast is both good hospitality and good business. Auntie Zhao has also risen because she rises with Liu Wei, and they do not separate the domestic from the commercial in this way. If he is serving guests, she is serving guests. She brings flatbread and the last of the previous night's tea, reheated, and the two Sogdians eat, standing up in the courtyard, in the efficient way of people who are already mentally on the road. They pay Liu Wei with copper coins, the exact amount agreed upon the previous evening. No renegotiation, because price renegotiation is the tactic of men who do not intend to pass this way again, and Nanai Vandak fully intends to pass this way again on his return journey and wants to be remembered as a reliable customer. They exchange a few words about the condition of the road to the west. Liu Wei mentions that another traveller, a week ago, reported a section of washed-out track that had been partially repaired but was still difficult. And then the camels are loaded, and Nanai Vandak is casting a last look around the courtyard to make sure nothing has been left, a habit so ingrained it does not require conscious thought. The gates are opened. Liu Wei swings them wide with the practiced motion of a man who has opened this gate thousands of times, and the camels move through them with the loose-limbed, slightly rolling gait of their kind, heads up, the loaded packs on their backs swaying slightly. Varazdad follows, leading his horse. Nanai Vandak pauses at the gate and turns back, and he and Liu Wei exchange a final bow, the compact professional bow of men who respect their mutual transaction. And then he too is through the gate, and the road is carrying him westward. Liu Wei closes the gate. Not all the way. He leaves it slightly ajar, because Master Chen and young Zhang will both need to leave before too long, and he stands in the courtyard for a moment, in the pre-dawn quiet, listening to the departing camel's footsteps recede. There is a particular quality to the sound of a loaded camel caravan moving away from you on a quiet road. The soft, heavy footfall, the creak of loaded packs, the occasional grunted breath, and then silence, rapidly, because the road absorbs the sound quickly, and within a few minutes there is no trace. The sky to the east is just beginning to lighten, not yet color, just a very slight graying of the dark along the mountain horizon, and a few birds are beginning to make tentative sounds in the scrubby vegetation along the road's edge. Dawn on the Silk Road comes in this sequence. First, the slight graying, then a band of deep blue along the horizon, then the first pale gold, and then the sun itself, appearing with a suddenness that always seems slightly dramatic, as though it has been working up to this moment all night, and is now finally ready. Master Chen stirs at the sound of the Sogdians' departure. Government officials tend to be lighter sleepers than merchants, trained by decades of official business to respond to disturbance, and lies for a moment, assessing the day. His escort soldiers are in the common room. He has noted their presence throughout the night from the sounds of their sleeping. His horse is stabled. His documents are in his saddlebag, which is in his room, which is locked. Everything is as he left it. He allows himself the luxury of another few minutes of horizontal contemplation, reviewing in his mind the documents he read yesterday and the inspection procedures he will follow at today's depot. And then he rises with the deliberate, unhurried efficiency of a man who has been getting up at dawn in uncomfortable places for 30 years. Zhang wakes later, as young people will, even when they have been reciting sutras half the night, with the particular confusion of waking in an unfamiliar place. The ceiling is wrong, the sounds are wrong, the quality of the light coming through the gap in the door is wrong. And then the reorientation that comes in a second or two, the memory arriving. In Gansu, Road Dunhuang. He lies for a moment with this information, breathing into it, feeling the specific quality of his tiredness and the specific quality of his determination, which are always present together on this journey like complementary threads in a piece of cloth. He performs his morning practice before rising, a brief meditation, 3 prostrations toward the east where the sun is rising, a recitation of the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, in the quiet murmur that has been his morning voice since childhood. Then he rises, rolls his mat, folds his traveling clothes into their pack, and carries his water cup outside to rinse it at the well. The courtyard is alive now in the pale morning light. Liu Wei is sweeping, a long broom of bundled rushes moving across the packed earth in wide arc. Xiao Ding is feeding the remaining horses. Auntie Zhao is visible in the kitchen doorway, her small daughter strapped to her back in a cloth carrier, a steam of cooking smells coming out around her. 2 new guests have arrived while everyone slept. Silent men who presented their documents, were assigned a room, slept for a few hours, and are now readying their horses with the focused speed of people who are in a genuine hurry. Zhang fills his water jug at the well, which has a hand-powered windlass and a wooden bucket worn smooth by years of use. The water comes up cold and slightly mineral, the same slightly mineral edge that he noticed in the spring water yesterday, and he drinks a few mouthfuls before filling the jug. He performs this act with complete attention, the way his training has taught him to perform simple physical tasks. Fully present, not somewhere else in his mind, the cold of the water and the roughness of the wooden bucket and the sound of the windlass and the smell of the morning air, all fully registered. This quality of attention is one of the things Buddhist practice is for. Among its other purposes, the ability to be completely in the present moment rather than elsewhere, which is harder than it sounds and which the road, with its daily novelties and demands, actually assists. Breakfast is millet porridge with a handful of dried fruit, the same porridge that was in the pot last night, reheated, with a different character in the morning light than it had by lamplight, somehow both plainer and more satisfying. Zhang eats it at one of the low tables in the main room, seated cross-legged on a cushion, and he eats it with the same quality of attention he gave to filling his water jug. Master Chen eats at the other table, more briefly, because he has more distance to cover and less philosophical reason to linger. They exchange a few polite words, the mutual courtesies of people who have shared a space but have no other connection. And then the salt official is up and calling for his horse. The escort soldiers appear from the common room, slightly disheveled but alert, buckling on their sword belts with the automatic movement of men who have been doing this every morning for years. They do not eat with Chen. The etiquette of official travel was precise about these things. But they appear with their own provisions, dried rations of the kind that soldiers carry, and eat standing in the courtyard, while Chen mounts his horse and checks that his saddlebag is properly secured. The departure of the salt official is slightly more formal than the departure of the merchants. Liu Wei bows more deeply, the bow that acknowledges government rank. Master Chen nods, returns a lesser bow that acknowledges he has registered the appropriate deference, and turns his horse toward the gate. One of the soldiers opens it, and then Chen rides out, his escort flanking him at the steady, deliberate pace that has carried him along 1,000 miles of road over a career of government service. Zhang watches this departure from the courtyard gate. He has no escort, no official rank, no horse. He will walk, as pilgrims walk, as the act of pilgrimage requires. He hoists his pack, settles its weight across his shoulders, picks up the walking staff he has been using since the journey began. He bows to Liu Wei, a deep, sincere bow, the bow of a young monk who has learned the proper forms of respect and who means them. And Liu Wei bows back with a warmth that slightly exceeds the formal requirement, because there is something about this young man's evident sincerity that Liu Wei finds affecting in a way he would not be able to fully articulate. And then Zhang steps through the gate and onto the road, heading west into a morning that is building toward its full brightness, the mountains clean and sharp in the early light, the road ahead visible for several miles before it bends around a spur of hill and disappears. He is alone on the road at this moment, though that will change soon enough. Other travelers will appear from both directions, and the road will resume its daytime character as a thoroughfare of continuous human movement. But for this moment, in the early morning light, with the mountains above him and the desert to his right and the road ahead, he is the only person visible in a landscape that stretches to the horizon and beyond, and there is something both humbling and exhilarating about this that he has not yet grown used to, and may never quite grow used to, all the way to Dunhuang. Liu Wei latches the gate and turns back to the courtyard, where Auntie Zhao and Xiao Ding are already at work on the day's first tasks. The new guests who arrived in the night are sleeping still. The inn has other guests due today, but he has a rough sense, from the intelligence of the road, that a small caravan from the east is a few days behind schedule, and should have arrived yesterday, which means it might arrive today, and a caravan means multiple animals and multiple people, and a substantial night's income. He will need to make sure the stable is clean and ready, the supply of fodder adequate, the kitchen stocked for a larger meal. He begins his mental inventory of tasks and resources with the automatic efficiency of a man for whom this inventory is as natural as breathing. Let us linger for a few more hours in this world, for the road is not done with its stories, and there is still the day to consider the specific quality of daylight in this landscape, the sounds and smells of the road in the middle hours. The morning is cold and brilliant, the way clear autumn mornings are in this part of the world, with a sky of such deep, clean blue that it seems almost too vivid to be real. The mountains to the south are catching the direct light now, and their rocky faces are warm amber and terracotta, the colors of fired clay. In the valleys between the peaks, where the angle of light creates shadow, the color shifts to a deep purple blue that contrasts with the warmer tones above in a way that seems almost deliberately beautiful. The road in the morning is gradually filling. From the east, from China, from the heartland, there is a small group of traders, perhaps a family enterprise rather than a large commercial house, traveling with a single cart pulled by an ox and carrying bolts of undyed silk. They will not get a spectacular price for undyed silk in the Western markets, where the demand is for the sophisticated dyed and patterned silks produced in the workshops of the Tang capital and the great textile centers of the lower Yangtze. But they have something to trade, and the road is open, and the calculation for a family with limited capital and a cart and an ox is that any profit is worth pursuing. From the west, moving eastward, there is a group of Tibetan pilgrims heading for one of the Buddhist sites further east in the corridor. They are 8 in number, wearing the heavier robes of the Tibetan style, their faces weather-darkened and their pace steady. They speak to nobody they pass, but bow to Zhang when they meet him on the road, the quick, deep bow of one Buddhist to another, and Zhang bows back with a warmth that crosses the language barrier completely. Buddhism was the one language they shared, a system of gesture and mutual recognition that functioned across the political boundaries of the Tibetan and Tang worlds. Along the road's margins, where the gravel gives way to slightly better watered ground, there are tamarisk bushes, now at the end of their growing season, their fine feathery branches still holding a few faded pink flowers. Tamarisk is one of the characteristic plants of this world. It tolerates the salt in the soil, which other plants cannot, and its roots find water at depths that would be inaccessible to less persistent plants, and its presence along road margins and around oasis springs is one of the reliable visual markers of the Silk Road landscape. Birds. Small finches, a few types, specific to this desert region, work the tamarisk branches for seeds, and their thin, piping calls are one of the constant sounds of the morning road. The sky, so clear this morning, is beginning in the far north to show the first suggestion of cloud, a thin, high cirrus, barely visible, of the kind that sometimes precedes a change in weather. Liu Wei, who watches the sky with the professional attention of a man whose business is affected by weather, has noticed this and has made a mental note. If that cloud thickens, there may be rain in 2 or 3 days, possibly snow at altitude. He will mention this to travelers who stop today heading west, because a pass blocked by early snow is one of the genuine dangers of the route, and travelers who set out without adequate preparation for it can find themselves in serious difficulty. The caravanserai system, the network of inns, way stations, government relay posts, and informal stopping points that made long-distance travel possible, was one of the Tang world's great infrastructural achievements, though it was never planned or designed as a system in the modern sense. It grew organically over centuries, each inn occupying a position that had proven by use to be the right distance from the next inn. A day's travel, roughly, which meant roughly 20 to 30 miles depending on terrain and the speed of the traveler. The spacing was not perfect. There were sections of the road where gaps in the system meant a long, waterless day or a night in the open, and these sections were known and feared and planned around. But over most of the main routes, the system worked with a reliability that had allowed commerce and pilgrimage and government communication to flow continuously along the Silk Road for centuries. Inside the inn, as the morning continues, the domestic life of the establishment is in full operation. Auntie Zhao has sent Xiaoding to a nearby farm, half a mile down a side track off the main road, to buy eggs and a bundle of dried vegetables, because the supply of fresh produce that she needs for tonight's cooking requires replenishment. Xiaoding sets off with a basket and a small pouch of coins, walking with the quick, loose stride of a child who spends most of his time outdoors and is entirely comfortable in this landscape. He knows the farm family by name, they sell to the inn regularly and the relationship is well established, a small instance of the dense network of commercial relationships that surround even an isolated roadside establishment. Liu Wei himself is repairing a section of the courtyard wall where the rammed earth has begun to crumble at a corner, a task that requires nothing more sophisticated than mixing more earth and tamping it firmly into the gap, but that needs to be done before the winter rains make it worse. He works at this steadily, with the methodical attention of a craftsman who takes the maintenance of his physical infrastructure seriously, because an inn with deteriorating walls and leaking roofs loses guests and reputation quickly. The walls of his inn are the walls his father maintained and his grandfather's generation built, and keeping them sound is both practical necessity and a kind of continuity with the past. Meanwhile, back on the road, let's think about the larger movement that surrounds this inn, about what the Silk Road was at this moment in its history, carrying in both directions. Eastbound into China, horses, glass, lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan in modern Afghanistan, the deep blue stone that had been traded from this source across the ancient world since the time of the pharaohs. Ivory, carried by elephant from South Asia to the oasis markets, then transferred to camel for the desert crossing. Cotton cloth from Central Asia, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, gold and silver in coin and bullion, grape wine for which there was a significant Chinese market. The Tang court was particularly partial to it, and vineyards had been established in the Turfan oasis under Tang administration specifically to supply the capital's appetite. Persian and Byzantine glassware, Indian spices, woolen textiles, slaves occasionally, though the slave trade was a minor part of the overall commerce. Westbound from China, silk in enormous quantities, the commodity that gave the road its name. Bronze and iron goods, lacquerware. Ceramics, especially the fine Tang white porcelains and the three-coloured Sankai wares that have been found in archaeological sites across the Islamic world and as far west as Egypt. Paper, increasingly. Printing technology just beginning to develop in this period. Tea in the pressed brick form. And above all, the sophisticated organizational and manufacturing capabilities of the Tang economy, which produced goods of a quality and quantity that could not be matched anywhere else in the world of 800 AD. The balance of trade in this period generally favored China. The Tang economy was the largest in the world, and it produced goods, particularly silk and ceramics, for which there was unlimited global demand. The silver and gold that flowed into China from the west did not flow back out in equal measure, which is one of the reasons why Tang China accumulated enormous reserves of precious metal. The government eventually tried to address this imbalance by restricting the export of silk at certain points, which was as effective as most protectionist trade policies, not very, and the commerce continued substantially regardless. The afternoon will bring more arrivals at Liu Wei's inn, and these arrivals will bring their own stories. An elderly scholar travelling to take up a teaching position at a provincial academy, accompanied by his adult son, who serves as his assistant and travel manager. A merchant from Dunhuang heading east with a load of Buddhist manuscripts for sale to wealthy patrons in the Tang heartland. The trade in manuscripts both religious and secular, was a significant commercial enterprise, and professional copyists at the Dunhuang libraries made copies of texts specifically for the commercial market, as well as for religious purposes. A small military detachment, 3 soldiers, and a corporal carrying routine dispatches between garrison posts. And late in the afternoon, just before the light begins to fail, the caravan that Liu Wei has been expecting, 8 camels and a dozen people, a substantial commercial operation managed by a Uyghur merchant named Tokto, who has been making this run between the eastern Tang markets and the oasis cities of the western Tarim Basin for 20 years, and who knows Liu Wei as well as any regular business associate. Tokto is a large man, wide-shouldered and loud, with a personality that seems to expand to fill whatever space he occupies, and his arrival in the courtyard transforms it instantly. The camels kneeling on command with their characteristic protest, the handlers calling out to each other, Tokto himself bellowing for Liu Wei in a voice that could be heard from the road. Liu Wei greets him with genuine warmth. This is a man he has known for 20 years, a reliable customer and a useful source of road intelligence, and their relationship has the particular intimacy of people who see each other only a few times a year, but whose meetings are always significant. They embrace in the Central Asian style, and Liu Wei begins immediately to assess the caravan. How many animals need stabling? How many people need rooms? What does Tokto's cook need from the kitchen versus what Auntie Zhao will provide? And what is the mood of the merchant, tired and wanting quiet, or energized and wanting company? Which will determine the character of the evening. Tokto wants company. He is energized by arrival, as he always is. The road exhausts his body, but does not touch his appetite for conversation. And within half an hour he has organized a communal dinner in the main room, his people and Liu Wei's remaining guests, and Liu Wei himself, all eating together at the long table in the democratic way of the road, where shared exhaustion and shared hunger are stronger social bonds than rank or origin. The food is more abundant tonight because Tokto has contributed provisions from his own stores, dried meat, dried fruit, a skin of the fermented mare's milk that is the traditional beverage of the Uyghur and Turkic world, and that Liu Wei drinks with polite appreciation, and Auntie Zhao declines. The conversation at this communal meal ranges widely because Tokto is a man who has been everywhere and knows something about everything. He has been to Kashgar, to Samarkand, to the kingdom of Khotan, where the best jade in the world comes from. He has seen the Buddhist cave temples of Kizil, painted in a style different from the Dunhuang caves but equally magnificent. He has done business with Sogdian merchants, Arab merchants, Tibetan merchants, Hindu merchants from India. He speaks 5 languages imperfectly and too well, and he manages in the gaps with the elaborate system of gesture and commercial shorthand that the multilingual world of the Silk Road had developed as its working communication tool. He has news from the West. The situation at a certain mountain pass that had been subject to Tibetan toll-taking has improved because a Tang military reinforcement of the nearby garrison has made the Tibetan collectors nervous, and they have pulled back from their most aggressive positions. He has seen, in the last oasis city he passed through, a new variety of cotton cloth being produced that is lighter and more finely woven than what has been available before, and he predicts it will find a market in the Tang capital if someone brings samples to the attention of the textile merchants there. He has also seen, and this he mentions with a slight gravity that quiets the table for a moment, a section of road 3 days west that was in poor condition after a series of autumn storms and where a heavily loaded cart had gotten stuck and blocked the road for a day while other travelers helped free it. Road maintenance on the Silk Road was, like the road itself, a matter of multiple overlapping responsibilities that were never quite as clearly assigned as ideally they should have been. The Tang government was responsible for the roads within the official relay station system, But this responsibility ended at the boundaries of garrison territories, and in the gaps between garrison zones, the responsibility fell theoretically to local government offices but practically to nobody in particular, which meant that deteriorating sections were repaired when traffic pressure made them impassable and ignored otherwise. Tokto, who has strong opinions about this from the purely practical perspective of a man who loses money every time his caravan is delayed, expresses these opinions with the vigor of someone who has been expressing them for 20 years without visible effect. The evening deepens, candles are lit, and then oil lamps because the communal dinner has gone on longer than usual. Tokto's company extends dinner the way strong weather extends time, creating its own particular density of experience. The food is finished, but the wine is not, and the wine, the pale, cloudy rice wine of the region, has done its work on the tiredness of the day and produced the specific warm looseness of an inn evening when things are going well. Tokto tells stories. The story of a caravan that lost all its water in the Taklamakan desert and was saved by a chance meeting with a Tibetan herder who knew where a hidden spring was. The story of a merchant who tried to avoid customs duties by hiding silver coins in the hollow legs of a table he was transporting and was caught by an unusually thorough inspector. The story of the most beautiful horse he ever saw, a Fergana mare of pure white that a Central Asian chieftain had given as a diplomatic gift to the Tang court, and that was being transported eastward in a cart with silk curtains on its sides. Liu Wei's children, 2 older ones, 7 and 9, who are officially supposed to be in bed, have crept into the doorway of the main room to listen, drawn by Tokto's voice and the warmth and light of the communal dinner. And Tokto, noticing them, does not drive them away, but instead addresses the story of the white horse directly to them, elaborating its beauty with the instinct of a natural storyteller who knows his audience. The children listen with the wide, still attention of children hearing a good story, and Liu Wei watches them from across the table with the expression of a man who knows he should insist they go to bed and cannot quite bring himself to do it yet. This is the world, not the world of emperors and armies and the great geopolitical movements that fill the history books, but the world of children in doorways listening to stories about white horses, of a good meal made from simple ingredients by a skilled cook from Sichuan, of Uyghur and Chinese and Sogdian people eating together at a long table in a lamplight room, of camels sleeping in a courtyard under autumn stars, of a young monk somewhere on the road in the dark, still walking west by starlight because he started late and is making up the distance, his lips moving in the recitation of the Diamond Sutra, each step a step toward Dunhuang. The Silk Road moved in both directions, not only physically but temporally. It was always simultaneously the road of the present and the road of everything that had passed along it before. The same track that Nanivandak and his camels travelled tonight had been travelled by Han Dynasty soldiers 200 years before the birth of Christ. It had been travelled by Buddhist missionaries bringing the Dharma east in the first centuries of the Common Era. It had been travelled by the messengers of warring kingdoms and the representatives of collapsing empires, and the survivors of natural disasters seeking new lives in distant places. Every step on the Silk Road was a step on ground that had been walked by an almost incomprehensible accumulation of human movement and human intention, and yet each individual traveller experienced it simply as a road, as the specific texture of packed earth under their feet, or the specific rhythm of a camel's gait, as the specific quality of the air at a particular altitude, as the specific combination of hunger and tiredness and wonder and purpose that long-distance travel produces. The historical weight of the route was there, but not felt directly the way you don't feel the weight of the atmosphere, even though it presses down on you at all times. What you felt was the immediate, the cold, the distance, the food, the company of strangers who were, after a day or two of shared road, beginning to feel like something more than strangers. Tokto's caravan will leave in the morning. Tokto himself will sleep heavily and without drama, because he is a man at peace with the road, and in the morning he will be up before the others, and will have his camels ready, and his packs loaded, and his people roused in the efficient, unstressed way of a man who has been doing this for 20 years. He will pay Liu Wei with an ease that comes from old familiarity. The established rate, a small extra amount for the quality of the dinner, and the understanding that the next time he passes through, there will be a room and a meal ready without prior negotiation. Liu Wei will stand at the gate as Tokto's caravan moves out, and after they are gone he will close the gate and stand in the early morning quiet of his courtyard and perform his own version of the daily assessment. Who is here? Who is coming? What needs to be done? What is the state of the supplies? What is the weather doing? This assessment is identical in structure to the one he performs every morning, and will continue to perform every morning for the rest of his working life, because the road continues and the inn continues, and the work of hospitality, the ancient work of feeding and sheltering the traveller, continues with a persistence that outlasts any individual traveller's journey. Somewhere to the east, the sun has risen over the mountains of central China. The light is moving westward along the road, arriving first at the eastern end of the Gansu corridor, and then moving in the direction that Nanai Vandak and Varazdad are travelling. The direction that Yangzhang is travelling, the direction that every westbound traveller on the Silk Road is travelling. It reaches Liu Wei's inn just as he finishes his morning assessment, turning the grey of pre-dawn into gold, warming the cold stone of the courtyard wall, catching the underside of the roof tiles and illuminating them from below in a way that makes them look almost luminous. The oil lamps inside the inn go out, one by one, as the daylight makes them unnecessary. Auntie Zhao is in the kitchen beginning the preparations for the day, her small daughter on her back, and the sound of her Sichuan-inflected humming audible through the kitchen wall. Xiao Ding is opening the gate to the full morning, pushing it wide and latching it back, and the sound of the road comes in. The creak of a cart somewhere in the distance, the barking of the dogs at the nearby farm, the wind in the tamarisk. Liu Wei pours water from the well over his hands and face, a morning ritual that is both hygienic and orienting, the shock of the cold water completing the process of waking up. He dries his hands on his robe and looks east along the road, squinting slightly into the early sun. Somewhere to the east, the day's first travellers are already on the road moving toward him. Some of them will stop. Some will pass. Some will be carrying goods he has seen before. Some will be carrying things he has never encountered. Some will be simple, and some will be complex, and all of them will be human beings in need of food and rest, which is the only thing he needs to know about them to do his job well. The road runs west through the Gansu corridor, through the gates of jade, and into the desert beyond. It runs through the Tarim Basin oases, Hami, Turfan, Kucha, Khotan, Kashgar, and over the mountain passes into Central Asia, and from there across the Iranian plateau and the Mesopotamian flatlands and the Syrian desert to the Mediterranean, where the road in some sense ends, though in another sense it simply becomes the sea. Along every mile of this road there are men and women like Liu Wei doing the same essential work, the cooking and the cleaning and the managing of animals and the feeding of travelers and the maintenance of the physical infrastructure that makes the whole thing possible. The history of the Silk Road is sometimes told as the history of its most famous travelers, the merchants and the diplomats and the explorers and the missionaries who wrote accounts of their journeys that survive to be read today. But the history of the road is also the history of the people who stayed put, the innkeepers and their wives, the stable boys, the cooks, the farmers who supplied the inns, the garrison soldiers who kept the road nominally safe, the blacksmiths who repaired the equipment, the water carriers who served the oases. These people did not travel, they made travel possible. As the morning settles into its working rhythm and the inn begins the day's business in earnest, let us pull back slowly from this particular courtyard, this particular road, this particular moment in the autumn of the year 800 AD, and think about what we have been witnessing. We have been inside an ordinary night in an ordinary inn on the most extraordinary road in the world. We have met a merchant who was thinking about the price of glass, and a bureaucrat who was thinking about retirement, and a monk who was learning to be present in each moment, and an innkeeper who kept his gate open through the night because you never knew when someone would need to come in. None of them were famous. None of them left records of their own. The specific people we have imagined tonight, Nanai Vandak and Varazdad and Master Chen and Zhang and Liu Wei and Auntie Zhao and Xiaoding, are composites, constructions from the real historical record, populated with the specific details that the Dunhuang manuscripts and the archaeological evidence and the Tang Dynasty literature and the centuries of Silk Road scholarship have given us. But people exactly like them existed. They ate this food and slept in these beds and travelled this road and made these calculations and felt this cold and saw these stars. The Tang Dynasty was not an abstraction, it was people waking up in the morning with purposes and limitations and small daily competencies and the ongoing effort to make sense of a world that was, at every moment, both vast and immediate. The Silk Road of 800 AD would not last forever in this form. The Tang Dynasty collapsed in 907, and the century of fragmentation that followed disrupted the road substantially. The political unification that made long-distance travel relatively safe within Tang territory disappeared, and the bandit activity and local warfare that had always been a background risk became a more serious obstacle. The Islamic world was changing too, becoming more fragmented after the high point of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the smooth commercial connections that had linked Chinese markets to Middle Eastern markets became rougher and less reliable. The Silk Road continued. It always continued, because the demand for the goods it carried never disappeared. But it was different, and the golden age of Tang cosmopolitan commerce was over. In 848, Dunhuang was retaken from the Tibetans by a Chinese military leader named Zhang Yichao, and the cave temples and their libraries continued to develop for another 2 centuries. The great ceiling of the library cave, that chamber, containing thousands of manuscripts, among them the earliest known printed book and the largest collection of Tang period documents anywhere in the world, happened somewhere around 1000 AD for reasons that are still debated by scholars. Perhaps a threat of invasion caused the monks to seal their most precious texts for safekeeping, and then the invasion came and the monks died or fled, and nobody survived to open the chamber again. It was not opened until 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who was doing restoration work on the cave complex and broke through a plastered wall to find the chamber filled floor to ceiling with bundles of manuscripts. Young Zhang, travelling toward Dunhuang this morning, would spend years there studying the texts in that library, then still very much an active repository rather than a sealed time capsule. He would copy sutras and commentary, he would study calligraphy and Sanskrit and perhaps a few words of Tibetan. He would paint, if he had the talent for it, or help in the workshop that produced the cave murals. He would become, in time, a teacher himself, and students would come to him the way he came to the masters at Dunhuang, carrying letters of introduction from abbots in distant provinces, carrying the same hope and the same carefully packed travelling kit, and the same exhaustion and determination. But all of that is future. This morning he is on the road, walking west, and the road ahead of him is the road as it simply is. Packed earth, gravel margins, mountain to the left, desert to the right, and the clean autumn air carrying the faintest promise of winter. He is reciting the Diamond Sutra as he walks, and the words of the sutra and the rhythm of his walking have become the same thing, each step a syllable, each syllable a step, so that the text and the movement are not two things, but one thing. The Bodhisattva who acts without attachment to the fruits of action, the form that is emptiness and the emptiness that is form, the raft that carries you across the river and that you leave on the bank when you reach the other side because you don't carry a raft on dry land. These are not abstractions for Zhang in this moment. They are the specific quality of his footfall on the Gansu corridor on a cold October morning in the year of the Tang Dynasty, when everything was still moving and the road was still open and the caves at Dunhuang were waiting, full of light. And back at Liu Wei's inn, the gate is wide open and the morning has fully arrived. There are travellers coming. There will always be travellers coming. The fire in the kitchen is burning well, the camels are fed, the millet is on the stove, and Liu Wei is at the gate, watching the road. This is his world, and this is his work, and somewhere in the space between the enormous history of the Silk Road and the small daily competencies of a man who keeps his inn in order and his gate open, the whole remarkable story lives. The merchants and the monks and the soldiers and the pilgrims and the officials and the wanderers of 1,000 years of trans-Eurasian connection, they all passed through gates like this one, and someone, like Liu Wei, was always at the gate, watching the road, ready to receive whoever the road sent next. The Tang Dynasty, in at the edge of the Silk Road on a cold October morning in 800 AD. The road runs west into a world of astonishing breadth and complexity, connecting this small, warm courtyard to the libraries of Baghdad and the workshops of Samarkand and the mosques of Mecca and the monasteries of northern India and the mountain kingdoms of Tibet and the steppe empires of the Uyghurs and the jade mines of Khotan and the glass blowers of Byzantium and everything in between. And the road runs east, back into the heart of China, to Chang'an, with its 1,000,000 inhabitants, and its polo fields, and its foreign music, and its grand bureaucracy, and its market that wanted everything the world could produce. Everything was connected by this road, and the people who travelled it, and the people who made their lives along its margins, and in the long, slow turn of history, some of the things connected by this road in 800 AD, the ideas, the technologies, the artistic traditions, the commercial habits, are still with us, embedded in the fabric of the world that grew out of that one. The fire is warm, the road goes on, and somewhere on it a young monk is walking, his lips moving, carrying the Dharma westward into a cold and luminous morning. Sleep well,